and April 1991. The French Riviera. Mohamed al-Mabah wasn't the name on the passport, and the man who would later become one of Hamas's most wanted had not yet earned his infamy. But another man, and another Palestinian middleman moving through the shadows of Europe's arms trade, was about to have his story end on the sun-drenched streets of Cannes, and his name was Adif Biso. He stood on the balcony of his hotel room overlooking the Mediterranean, the smell of salt air mixing with expensive cologne. Below, and the Boulevard de la Croisette hummed with the controlled chaos of the Cannes Film Festival. Limousines glided past palm trees, and photographers clustered like gulls around starlets in evening gowns. The beautiful people of cinema had descended on this pocket of southern France, and somewhere among them, hidden in plain sight, were the men who had come to kill him. Biso didn't know it yet. He was careful, always careful, but he had allowed himself this trip. A moment of normalcy in a life lived between hotel rooms and unmarked offices. He was here ostensibly for the festival, and, though his real business had nothing to do with film, he was the Palestine Liberation Organization's security chief, a man who knew where the money flowed and where the weapons came from, and which European officials could be convinced to look the other way. He had survived Beirut. He had survived Tunisia. And he had survived the factional bloodletting within the PLO itself during the dark years of the 1980s. He believed he could survive Cannes. The year was significant, and the Gulf War had just ended. Saddam Hussein's forces had been driven from Kuwait, and the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East was fracturing in new and unpredictable ways. The PLO, which had backed Saddam, found itself isolated, and its leadership scattered across half a dozen countries, its finances strangled. Yasser Arafat was scrambling to rebuild credibility with Western powers, and Israel, and having watched Scud missiles fall on Tel Aviv, was in no mood for restraint. Mossad had been watching CISO for years, and not with the obsessive focus they reserved for bomb makers or hijackers, but with the patient attention given to logisticians. Men like CISO didn't pull triggers, and they facilitated. They connected the Palestinian factions in Lebanon with suppliers in Eastern Europe. They moved money through banks in Cyprus and Switzerland, and they attended meetings in Paris and Rome where deals were made that would later explode in Jerusalem or Haifa. Intelligence agencies understand a fundamental truth, and the man who arranges the shipment is often more valuable dead than the man who fires the gun. Kill a fighter, and another takes his place within weeks. Kill the middleman, and the entire network convulses. Supply lines dry up, contacts go silent. Paranoia spreads like a virus through the organization, and this was the calculation Mossad made in the spring of 1991. The operation had been authorized at the highest levels. Yitzhak Shamir, Israel's prime minister, and had given his quiet approval. The head of Mossad, Shabtai Shavit, had assigned the task to one of the agency's most experienced operational units, the Kedon, and the Bayonet, the department responsible for targeted killings. These were not soldiers. They were artists of violence, trained to blend into any environment, and to become invisible until the moment they struck. The team that arrived in Cannes in early June consisted of at least 8 operatives, possibly more, and they came separately, on different flights, carrying passports from half a dozen countries. Some posed as tourists, others as businessmen, and one or two may have even carried press credentials for the film festival itself. They checked into different hotels, never acknowledging each other in public, and communicating through pre-arranged signals and dead drops. They had one target, one window of opportunity. And they knew that if anything went wrong, and if French police caught wind of the operation, the diplomatic fallout would be catastrophic. But Mossad had been doing this for decades. They had killed in Rome, and in Athens, in Lillehammer, though that operation, the disastrous misidentification of a Moroccan waiter as a Palestinian terrorist, and still haunted the agency's institutional memory. They had learned from that failure. Now their intelligence was better. Their discipline was tighter, and their methods were cleaner. Adif Biso's schedule had been mapped out with surgical precision. The operatives knew where he was staying, the HLer Telmame de Tourande, and a mid-range establishment far enough from the festival's epicenter to offer some discretion, but close enough to the action to seem plausible. They knew his patterns, and the cafés he frequented, the meetings he attended, the times he left his room. Surveillance had been conducted for days. Photographs taken from long distances, and routes memorized. Escape paths identified. The French security presence at festival was focused on celebrities and dignitaries, and not on middle-aged men in unremarkable suits conducting quiet business in hotel lobbies. On the evening of June 8, 1991, Ciso returned to his hotel after dinner, and he had spent the day in meetings, details of which remain classified in both Israeli and French intelligence archives. He took the elevator to his floor and walked down the carpeted hallway and unlocked his door. The door closed behind him. He never heard the second set of footsteps, and what happened in the next 30 seconds would later be reconstructed from forensic evidence and witness statements, and though the full truth remains locked in Mossad's operational files. What is known as this, and Ciso was shot multiple times at close range with a pistol equipped with a suppressor. The weapon, almost certainly a 9mm or .22 caliber, and favored by professional assassins for its reliability and the availability of subsonic ammunition, made little more noise than a series of sharp coughs, and the bullet struck him in the head and chest. He collapsed immediately. There was no struggle, no time to cry out. It was efficient, clinical, and the work of someone who had done this before. The shooter, or shooters, left the room calmly, closing the door behind them. They walked down the hallway and took the stairs rather than the elevator and emerged onto the street where the festival was still in full swing. Within minutes, they had disappeared into the crowd, and it would be hours before Ciso's body was discovered. By the time French police arrived, the killers were already out of France, some crossing into Italy and others taking trains to Switzerland or Germany, all of them moving along carefully planned exfiltration routes. Their passports would be destroyed, and their aliases would never be used again. Within 72 hours, they would be back in Israel, debriefing their handlers in a secure facility outside Tel Aviv, and the French investigation would be thorough but ultimately fruitless. Interpol would be notified. European intelligence agencies would be consulted. And the conclusion would be unspoken but understood: this was a state-sponsored assassination, almost certainly carried out by Mossad, and there was little appetite among French authorities to pursue an investigation that would only embarrass everyone involved. But the story didn't end with Ciso's death. In fact, it was only beginning, because what happened in Cannes in June 1991 was not an isolated incident, and it was part of a much larger shadow war, one that had been raging since the founding of Israel, one that had claimed hundreds of lives across dozens of countries, and one that operated according to rules written in blood and secrecy. To understand why Adolf Ciso died on that hotel floor in Cannes, and you have to understand the machinery of targeted assassination that Israel had built over 4 decades. You have to understand the men who ran it, and the doctrine that guided it, and the enemies who shaped it. You have to understand Mossad. The doctrine of targeted assassination didn't begin with Mossad, and it began with a question that haunted the early founders of Israel: how do you protect a nation smaller than New Jersey, surrounded by enemies, and outnumbered 100 to 1? The answer, they decided, was to make your enemies afraid to plan against you. In 1948, and as the State of Israel declared its independence and 5 Arab armies invaded within hours, David Ben-Gurion understood something fundamental about survival. And Israel could win conventional wars. The outnumbered Haganah militias had proven that much, but it couldn't afford to fight them constantly. The human cost was too high, and the economic burden too crushing. What Israel needed was a strategy of preemption, of striking before the knife came out, and of making potential attackers understand that nowhere was safe. This philosophy was crystallized in the early 1950s by a man named Esser Harel, and the second director of Mossad, and arguably the architect of Israel's modern intelligence doctrine. Harel was short, unassuming, and with thick glasses that made him look more like a librarian than a spy master. But behind those glasses was a mind that understood violence as a language and assassination as a tool of statecraft. Harel believed in what would later be called active defense, and the idea that Israel's security services shouldn't merely respond to attacks, but should actively hunt down those planning them. This wasn't revenge, and though revenge certainly played a role, this was operational logic. If you killed the planners, the engineers, the financiers, the operations collapsed before they began. And the policy was codified after the 1972 Munich Olympics massacre. 11 Israeli athletes and coaches, and taken hostage by Palestinian terrorists from the group Black September, were murdered in a botched German rescue attempt that shocked the world, and the images of masked gunmen on the Olympic Village balcony became seared into global consciousness. For Israel, Munich represented a fundamental failure, and not of intelligence necessarily, but of deterrence. Prime Minister Golda Meir convened her cabinet in the days after Munich. The meeting was held in absolute secrecy, and no minutes were taken. What was decided in that room would shape Israeli counter-terrorism policy for the next 5 decades. Meir authorized Operation Wrath of God, and the mission was simple in concept, staggering in scope: hunt down and kill everyone involved in planning, funding, or executing the Munich attack, and not just the surviving terrorists, but the entire network. The logistics coordinators in Beirut, the financiers in Cyprus, the safe-house operators in Rome and Paris, and the leadership of Black September would be systematically dismantled, one bullet at a time. The operation would take years and stretch across 3 continents, and Mossad assembled specialist teams, the Kidon units, composed of operatives who could disappear into any European capital, who spoke multiple languages fluently, and who could assemble a bomb in a hotel bathroom or fire a pistol with surgical precision from a motorcycle. They were trained at a facility in the Negev desert, and running through scenarios again and again until the mechanics of killing became muscle memory. The first target was killed in Rome. Walls waiter, an Apilo representative and translator, was shot 12 times outside his apartment building in October 1972. The next was Mahmoud Hamshari, and killed by a bomb hidden in his telephone in Paris. Then Basil al-Kubaisi, gunned down on a Paris street in April 1973. Then Mahmoud Boudia, and killed by a pressure-activated bomb placed under his car seat. The Killinud through 1973 and into 1974. Some were clean operations and executed with precision and leaving no witnesses. Others were messy, attracting police attention and diplomatic protests. The worst was Lillehammer, Norway, and where Mossad agents mistakenly killed Ahmed Bouchiki, a Moroccan waiter they confused with Ali Hassan Salami, the supposed mastermind of Munich, and 6 Mossad operatives were arrested by Norwegian police. The incident became an international embarrassment, and Israel was forced to quietly acknowledge what everyone already knew. It was conducting assassinations on European soil. But the operations didn't stop, and they simply became more careful. By the 1980s, targeted killings had become a routine instrument of Israeli policy, and used not just against terrorists but against anyone deemed a strategic threat. Palestinian militants in Lebanon, Hezbollah commanders in Beirut, and scientists working on Arab weapons programs. The doctrine expanded, the target list grew, and the operations became more sophisticated, and this was the machinery that turned its attention to Adolf Bisiso. Bisiso's path to that hotel room in Cannes had begun decades earlier, and, in the refugee camps of Gaza, where he grew up stateless, watching Israeli patrols move through his neighborhood with the casual authority of occupiers, and he had joined the PLO in the 1960s, rising through the ranks not as a fighter but as an administrator, and the kind of man who understood that revolutionary movements run on logistics as much as ideology. By the 1980s, and he had become indispensable to Yasser Arafat's inner circle. He coordinated security for PLO leadership scattered across Tunisia, Yemen, and Jordan after their expulsion from Lebanon. He liaised with European governments willing to maintain back-channel communications with the Palestinians, and he managed the flow of funds from Gulf states sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. Israeli intelligence had a file on him 6 inches thick, and they knew about his meetings with Eastern European arms dealers in Prague and Warsaw. They knew about his contacts within French intelligence and relationships built on mutual interest and quiet understanding. They knew he had been present at meetings where attacks against Israeli targets were discussed, and, though whether he actively participated or merely observed remained a matter of interpretation, and what made Siso valuable to Mossad as a target wasn't just what he knew but who he connected. He was a node in a network, and networks are fragile things, and cut the right connections, and the entire structure weakens. The decision to kill him in Cannes was opportunistic, but not impulsive, and Mossad had likely been planning contingencies for years, waiting for the right moment when Bisiso would be vulnerable, and away from the protected compounds of Tunis or the crowded streets of Amman where an operation would be too risky. The Cannes Film Festival provided perfect cover, and the city was flooded with foreigners. Security was focused on celebrities, not anonymous Middle Eastern businessmen, and local police were stretched thin managing crowds and paparazzi. And Biso, perhaps feeling secure in the glamorous chaos of the festival, and had lowered his guard just enough. The operational team that executed the assassination had been training for weeks, possibly months, and they had studied floor plans of his hotel, timed the movements of staff, identified blind spots in security camera coverage. They had backup plans for their backup plans and escape routes that branched like a river delta through the streets of Cannes. On the night of June 8th, everything went according to script. The shooter, and identified in some accounts as a woman, which would fit Mossad's pattern of using female operatives for close-range killings, and approached Biso's room at a moment when the hallway was empty. The door was either unlocked or open from inside, suggesting Biso may have been expecting someone, and perhaps even thought he recognized his killer. The suppressed pistol barked 4 times. Biso fell. The killer walked out, down the stairs, and into a waiting vehicle driven by another operative. They were gone before Biso's heart stopped beating, and the body was discovered 3 hours later by hotel staff who had come to investigate why Biso hadn't responded to a phone call. And the crime scene was processed by French forensic teams who found very little, no fingerprints, no shell casings, no DNA evidence. The killer had been wearing gloves, and had policed their brass, and had left nothing behind but a corpse. French investors interviewed dozens of hotel guests and staff. No one had seen anything unusual, and no one had heard shots. Though given the suppressor and the general noise of the festival, this wasn't surprising, and the few witnesses who remembered seeing anyone near Biso's room that evening described different people: a woman in business attire, a man with a maintenance cart, and a couple speaking Italian. All were Mossad operatives. None would ever be identified. The French government issued a formal protest to Israel, and, though it was delivered through diplomatic back channels rather than public statements, the Israelis neither confirmed nor denied involvement, and responding with the standard formulation that they do not comment on intelligence matters. Behind closed doors, and French intelligence understood exactly what had happened and why. What they didn't understand, what no one outside Mossad understood, and was how the operation fit into a larger pattern and a campaign of targeted killings that was intensifying as the 1990s progressed and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict entered a new and more violent phase. And because Adolf Biso wasn't the last name on the list, he was barely the beginning. The news of Biso's death reached Yasser Arafat in Tunis within hours, and the PLO chairman was in his compound, surrounded by layers of security that had grown increasingly paranoid since the Israeli Air Force bombed his headquarters in 1985. And he took the call in his office, his trademark keffiyeh draped over his shoulder, his hand trembling slightly as he set down the receiver. Another one gone, and Arafat understood immediately what Biso's assassination meant. It wasn't about punishing one man for past actions. It was a message written in blood, and no one in the Palestinian leadership was beyond reach. Not in Tunis, not in Amman, and certainly not in the glittering safety of a European film festival. And the pattern was unmistakable. In the 3 years leading up to Cannes, and Mossad had systematically eliminated key figures in Palestinian militant organizations with a precision that bordered on industrial. Abu Jihad, an Arafat's deputy and military commander, gunned down in his Tunis villa in 1988 in a commando team that arrived by sea. Fathi Shikaki, founder of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and shot in Malta in 1995. Yahya Ayash, the master bomb maker known as the Enir, killed by an exploding cell phone in 1996. And each operation demonstrated not just capability but reach. Mossad could strike in Arab capitals, in European cities, even in territories under Palestinian control, and the agency had informants who could track targets' movements, technical specialists who could turn everyday objects into weapons, and assassins who could vanish like smoke after pulling the trigger. But the Biso killing was different in one crucial respect. It happened in broad daylight, and metaphorically speaking, in one of the most visible cities in Europe, during one of its most celebrated events. It was audacious to the point of arrogance, and a demonstration that Israel's long arm extended even into spaces where Western intelligence agencies operated freely. The French were furious, privately, publicly, and they said little. This was the paradox of targeted assassination in the post-Cold War world, and European governments officially condemned extrajudicial killings and maintained that international law applied universally. But those same governments also understood that they faced their own terrorism threats, from Algerian militants, from Irish Republicans, from a dozen other groups, and the tactics Mossad employed weren't fundamentally different from those their own services occasionally used. The British SAS had killed IRA members in Gibraltar, and French intelligence had bombed a Greenpeace ship in New Zealand. The Americans had sent cruise missiles into Sudan and Afghanistan, and the moral high ground was a luxury no one could really afford. So the French investigated Bissot's murder with professional thoroughness, and knowing they would find nothing actionable, and the Israelis maintained strategic silence, knowing that silence was itself a form of deterrence. And within Palestinian circles, however, the assassination triggered something more visceral than diplomatic protest. It triggered fear, and Sizo's funeral in Tunis drew thousands of mourners. But many in the PL leadership noticed who wasn't there, and several high-ranking officials sent representatives rather than attending personally, citing security concerns. Others arrived in unmarked vehicles with armed escorts, and stayed only long enough to be seen, then disappeared back into protected compounds. The calculus of resistance had changed, and it was one thing to accept the risk of dying in combat, in an Israeli airstrike, or even in an assassination attempt in Beirut or Damascus, where such things were almost expected, and it was another thing entirely to be killed while having dinner in Paris or checking into a hotel in Rome. Mossad understood this psychological dimension perfectly, and the goal wasn't just to eliminate specific individuals, but to impose a Palestinian militancy that extended beyond the physical. And every PLO operative now had to think twice about traveling to Europe. Every meeting required additional security. Every phone call could be monitored, and every car could be rigged with explosives. The paranoia became operationally debilitating, and intelligence services call this degrading enemy capability. But the human reality was far more complex, and Palestinian organizations began to fracture along fault lines of fear and suspicion. Who could be trusted? Who might be an informant? Which hotel clerk, which taxi driver, and which casual acquaintance in a cafe might be reporting back to Mossad? In Gaza and the West Bank, and younger militants looked at the assassinations and drew a different conclusion. If peaceful negotiation made you a target, if logistical support made you a target, and if merely being in the PLO hierarchy made you a target, then what was the point of restraint? The early 1990s saw the rise of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and organizations that rejected Arafat's increasingly conciliatory approach to Israel. They embraced suicide bombing not just as a tactic but as a theological statement, and a form of warfare that turned every civilian into a potential threat and made traditional counterterrorism measures nearly impossible. And Mossad responded with more killings. The cycle accelerated through the decade. For every Hamas bomb maker eliminated, 2 more emerged from the refugee camps, and for every Hezbollah commander killed in Beirut, the organization recruited a dozen new fighters. The targeted assassination program, which was supposed to prevent attacks, and seemed instead to be fueling an endless spiral of violence and retaliation. Yet within Mossad, the operations were considered successful, and success wasn't measured in preventing all attacks. That was impossible, but in raising the cost of organizing them. And every Hamas operative who was killed represented months or years of training and experience lost. Every Hezbollah financier eliminated meant disrupted funding networks. And the attacks that didn't happen, the operations that were aborted, because key personnel were dead, those were the victories no one saw. And the public saw only the spectacular failures and the continuing violence. In 1997, Mossad attempted to assassinate Khaled Mashal, a senior Hamas leader, in Amman, Jordan, and the operation was an unmitigated disaster. 2 agents posing as Canadian tourists sprayed Mashal with a slow-acting poison, but they were captured by Jordanian security forces before they could escape. King Hussein of Jordan, furious at this violation of his sovereignty, and demanded that Israel provide the antidote to save Mashal's life and release the founder of Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, from prison. Israel complied, and the diplomatic humiliation was complete. But even that failure didn't stop the program. If anything, it reinforced within Mossad the need for better planning and better intelligence and cleaner operations. The mistakes of Amman would not be repeated. The next time they went after a senior Hamas official, and it would be executed with the precision that had characterized the CISO operation. That next time came in 2004, and when Israeli helicopter gunships fired missiles at Sheikh Yassin as he left morning prayers in Gaza City, killing him instantly. And it was no longer a covert assassination, but an open military strike, broadcast on television screens around the world. The rules had changed, and Israel was no longer pretending to operate in the shadows. But back in 1991 in Cannes, the operation still carried the weight of deniability, and still maintained the fiction that these were unsolved murders rather than state policy. CISO's killers had vanished completely, and their identities protected by the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the Middle East. The investigation files in French archives remain sealed, and the Israeli government has never acknowledged the operation. The operatives who carried it out have never spoken publicly, and bound by lifelong secrecy agreements and the knowledge that revealing classified operations could result in prosecution. What we know comes from fragments and leaked intelligence assessments, testimony from former Mossad agents speaking anonymously decades later, and circumstantial evidence pieced together by investigative journalists. The full story, the names of the operatives, the exact chain of command that authorized the killing, and all of that remains locked away. But the impact of CISO's death rippled far beyond the immediate tactical victory, and it demonstrated that the era of European sanctuary for Palestinian militants was over, and it signaled that Israel's willingness to conduct operations abroad had not diminished despite international criticism, and it established a template for future operations that would grow only more sophisticated and more deadly. By the time the 2000s arrived, and Mossad had perfected the art of the targeted killing, operations in Dubai, Damascus, and Tehran showcased technological capabilities that seemed almost science fiction, and exploding cell phones, remote-controlled machine guns, computer viruses that destroyed nuclear centrifuges, and the agency that had killed CISO with a simple pistol in a hotel hallway had evolved into something far more capable and far more lethal. And yet, for all the technological advancement, the fundamental calculation remained unchanged: identify the target, plan the operation, execute with precision, and vanish without trace. The same principles that guided the team in Cannes still governed operations 3 decades later, and the question that haunted critics of the program was whether it actually worked. Did assassinating Palestinian militants make Israel safer, or did it simply fuel an endless cycle of violence that claimed lives on both sides? The answer depended on who you asked, and when, and in the immediate aftermath of the CISO assassination, Israeli intelligence analysts compiled success metrics that looked impressive on paper, and shipments of weapons from Eastern Europe to Palestinian factions had been disrupted, and 3 planned attacks inside Israel had been canceled because key organizers were dead or in hiding, and the operational tempo of PLO military activities had slowed measurably. But 30 kilometers south of Tel Aviv, in the cramped apartments of Gaza City, and a different kind of metric was being calculated. Mohammed Deif was 29 years old in 1991. He had grown up in the Khan Yunis refugee camp and one of 7 children in a family that had fled their village during the 1948 war. His childhood was a catalogue of occupation Israeli checkpoints, arbitrary arrests, and curfews that lasted days, the constant low-grade humiliation of being stateless in your own land. When news of CISO's assassination reached Gaza, and Deif was already involved with Hamas, though not yet in a leadership role, and he was part of a younger generation that looked at the PLO's diplomatic maneuvering with contempt. Arafat was talking about peace negotiations, about 2-state solutions, and about coexistence. Meanwhile, men like CISO were being hunted down in European hotel rooms. The lesson Deif drew was simple: peace made you vulnerable. Only resistance, and total and uncompromising, offered any hope of dignity. He would go on to become the commander of Hamas's military wing, the most wanted man in Gaza, and surviving at least 7 Israeli assassination attempts over 3 decades. His life would become a mirror image of Mossad's doctrine: constant movement, absolute secrecy, and ruthless elimination of anyone who might betray him. He would orchestrate suicide bombings that killed hundreds of Israeli civilians, making him, in Israeli eyes, and precisely the kind of target that justified the entire assassination program. The irony was that operations like the Cannes killing helped create men like Mohammed Deif, and this was the strategic paradox that Israeli policymakers grappled with behind closed doors, usually late at night, and over cigarettes and bitter coffee in secure conference rooms in Tel Aviv, and every successful assassination removed a specific threat but potentially created dozens of new enemies. And every targeted killing demonstrated Israeli capability, but also Israeli vulnerability. Because if you had to keep killing enemies, and it meant the previous killings hadn't solved the problem. Some within Mossad understood this. They argued for more selective targeting and for longer-term strategies that combined intelligence operations with political initiatives. Others insisted that the program worked precisely as intended, and it kept enemies off balance, it disrupted operations, it demonstrated consequences for violence against Israeli citizens, and the debate was never resolved because it couldn't be. Counterterrorism is not a problem with a solution. It's a condition that must be managed indefinitely, and by the mid-1990s, as the Oslo Accords promised a new era of Israeli-Palestinian relations, the targeted killing program continued largely unchanged in the shadows, and Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister who shook Yasser Arafat's hand on the White House lawn in 1993, and was the same Rabin who had authorized numerous assassinations as defense minister, and he understood that peace negotiations required both a diplomatic track and a security apparatus willing to eliminate anyone who threatened the process. And this dual-track approach defined Israeli policy for the next 2 decades. Talk peace while preparing for war, and negotiate borders while eliminating enemies beyond those borders. Offer concessions at the bargaining table while running kill operations in Damascus and Beirut, and the international community largely accepted this arrangement because the alternatives seemed worse. What should Israel do instead? Allow militants to operate freely, and wait for attacks to happen before responding. The moral clarity that critics demanded existed only in theoretical frameworks and not in the messy reality of Middle Eastern politics, where everyone's hands were bloody. The CISO operation, viewed from this perspective, and was neither exceptional nor aberrant. It was simply standard procedure, one assassination among hundreds, and notable only because of where it happened and the audacity it represented. But for those who knew Adif Basizo personally, the strategic calculations meant nothing, and his family buried him in a cemetery in Tunis under a simple headstone that gave his name, his dates, and a verse from the Quran. And his widow told journalists that her husband had been a peaceful man, not a terrorist. She insisted he had been in Cannes on legitimate PLO business and seeking European support for Palestinian statehood. Mossad's files told a different story, detailed reports of meetings with arms dealers, and intercepted communications discussing weapons shipments, intelligence linking him to operational planning for attacks. Who was telling the truth? Perhaps both were, and in their own way. Basizo may have seen himself as a freedom fighter working through political channels, and, while Israeli intelligence saw the same activities as support for terrorism, the gap between these perspectives was unbridgeable, and which is why the conflict continued long after individual players were dead. By 2010, nearly 20 years after Cannes, and Mossad carried out perhaps its most elaborate assassination, the killing of Mahmoud Mabou in Dubai. The Hamas commander was tracked to his hotel, drugged, and suffocated by a hit team that consisted of more than 24 operatives. The entire operation was captured on hotel security cameras and, which produced a minute-by-minute reconstruction of one of the most sophisticated targeted killings ever attempted. The operatives used fake passports from Britain and Ireland, France, and Germany. They coordinated through encrypted communications. They maintained surveillance with multiple teams working in shifts, and they killed al-Mabou without leaving a single piece of physical evidence in his room. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing except a body. And it was the Basizo operation perfected, updated for the digital age with all the technological capabilities that 20 years of experience had refined. And yet, despite the sophistication, the fundamental vulnerabilities remained. Within days, and Dubai police had identified the operatives through facial recognition and passport records. Their photographs were broadcast globally, and several European countries issued arrest warrants. The operation succeeded tactically but failed strategically. Al-Mabou was dead, but Mossad had been publicly exposed, and its methods revealed in forensic detail. The embarrassment forced a temporary scaling back of operations abroad, though not a permanent cessation, and because targeted assassination, for all its limitations and contradictions, remained the cornerstone of Israeli counterterrorism strategy. Successive prime ministers, and Netanyahu, Olmert, Sharon, back to Netanyahu again, all authorized these operations with varying degrees of enthusiasm but consistent commitment, and the program had long since moved beyond individual revenge for Munich or tactical disruption of specific plots. It had become institutionalized, bureaucratized, and a permanent feature of Israeli national security policy with its own budget lines, training facilities, and career pathways. And young Mossad recruits in the 2010s studied the Basizo operation the way medical students study classic surgeries, not for the specific techniques, which had evolved, but for the operational principles. The importance of intelligence, the value of patience, the necessity of escape planning, the discipline of silence, and some of those recruits would go on to conduct operations in Syria against Iranian weapons facilities, in Lebanon against Hezbollah commanders, and in Gaza against Hamas leaders. They would use drones instead of pistols, cyber attacks instead of car bombs, but the underlying logic remained unchanged, and identify threats before they materialize and eliminate them with prejudice. Critics called it extrajudicial killing, state-sponsored terrorism, and a violation of international law. Defenders called it preemptive self-defense, justified under Article 51 of the UN Charter, and proportionate response to an existential threat. The legal arguments consumed thousands of pages in academic journals and international tribunals. Meanwhile, and in the real world, the operations continued. Adolf Basizo's name appeared in many of those academic discussions, usually as a footnote, and one case among dozens used to illustrate the evolution of Israeli assassination policy. His killing was analyzed for its operational characteristics and its diplomatic implications, its place in the broader arc of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What was rarely discussed was the human dimension, and the moment when a man checked into a hotel for a film festival, not knowing he had hours to live. The calculations his killers made as they waited in the hallway, and the split second when he saw the gun and understood, too late, what was about to happen. The emptiness his family felt when they received word from Tunis that he was gone, and history compresses these moments into strategic analysis, into lessons learned, into precedents for future operations. But in the moment, in the hotel room, and there was only fear and violence and the absolute finality of death. This was the reality that no intelligence briefing could fully capture, that every targeted killing, and no matter how justified in strategic terms, was also a deeply personal act of violence against a specific human being who had family, friends, dreams, and regrets. And 20 years after Cannes, a former Mossad operative agreed to speak with a journalist under conditions of strict anonymity. The interview took place in a Tel Aviv cafe, and unremarkable in every way except for what was discussed. The operative called him David, though that wasn't his name, and had been involved in multiple targeted killing operations during the 1990s, though he wouldn't specify which ones. When asked about the moral weight of assassination, and David was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that stayed with the journalist. People think we don't feel it. They think because we're trained, and because we believe in the mission, that pulling the trigger is easy. It's never easy. You carry every face with you, and he didn't confirm or deny involvement in the Basizo operation. He didn't need to. And the haunted quality in his voice suggested he had stood in hallways like that one in Cannes, had walked away from bodies, and had boarded flights under false names, knowing that somewhere a family was about to receive devastating news. The question I ask myself, David continued, is not whether what we did was justified. In the context we operated in, with the intelligence we had, the threats we faced, I still believe it was necessary, and the question is whether it was worth it. Whether the killing we did prevented more killing, or just created different killing. He didn't have an answer, and neither did the journalist. Neither does anyone really. Because the legacy of operations like Cannes is written not in victory or defeat, but in perpetuation. And the conflict didn't end. The violence didn't stop. New organizations replaced old ones, new leaders replaced dead ones, new tactics replaced obsolete ones. And the wheel kept turning. In 2004, Israel assassinated Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the founder and spiritual leader of Hamas, in a helicopter strike in Gaza City. In 2008, Ahmad Mugnayeh, Hezbollah's military commander and one of the world's most wanted terrorists, was killed by a car bomb in Damascus, and an operation widely attributed to Mossad working with the CIA. In 2020, an Iranian nuclear scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was killed on a highway outside Tehran. in an operation involving a remote-controlled machine gun. And each killing was more sophisticated than the last. Each generated international controversy. Each was defended by Israeli officials as necessary security measures, and each created ripples that spread outward in ways impossible to fully predict or control. And the family Adolf Ciso left behind scattered across the Middle East and Europe. His children grew up knowing their father had been assassinated by Israeli intelligence, and a fact that shaped their understanding of the world in profound ways. Some became politically active in Palestinian causes, and others tried to build normal lives far from the conflict. All of them carried the weight of his absence. In Gaza, Mohammed Def continued to evade assassination attempts, and becoming almost mythical in his elusiveness. Israeli forces tried to kill him with airstrikes that destroyed buildings, killed family members, left him severely wounded, but never dead. He became living proof that targeted assassination, for all its tactical precision, couldn't eliminate the human will to resist. By the 2020s, and the entire calculus of Middle Eastern conflict had shifted. Iran's nuclear program, the Syrian civil war, and the Abraham Accords normalizing relations between Israel and several Arab states, these developments reshaped the strategic landscape, and yet targeted assassination remained a constant, adapted to new threats but fundamentally unchanged in purpose. In November 2023, Israel claimed to have finally killed Mohammed Def in an airstrike in Gaza during the war that followed Hamas's October 7th attack. Hamas denied it initially, and then fell silent. The ambiguity itself was telling. Even death had become uncertain in this shadowland where truth was the first casualty. The October 7th attack, which killed over 200 Israelis in a single day, represented the catastrophic failure of the very doctrine that had justified decades of targeted killings. And all those assassinations, all that intelligence gathering, all those operations in Cannes and Dubai and Damascus, and Hamas still managed to organize the deadliest attack on Israeli civilians since the Holocaust. Within Mossad, the soul-searching was intense, and how had they missed the planning? How had their intelligence networks failed so completely? The answer involved organizational dysfunction, political complacency, and technological overconfidence, but it also raised the uncomfortable question of whether the targeted killing program had created such deep hatred that spectacular revenge became inevitable. And there's a Hebrew word, hin brera, that means no choice. It's used constantly in Israeli security discourse to justify harsh measures and to explain why peace remains elusive, to make moral sense of morally complex situations. We had no choice but to assassinate them. We had no choice but to strike first, and we had no choice but to continue the cycle. But Ein Brera is a story we tell ourselves. There are always choices, even if all of them are terrible. And Israel chose targeted assassination as a tool of national security because the alternatives, full-scale invasion, permanent occupation, negotiated compromise, and all seemed worse or unworkable given the political constraints. And Palestinian factions chose terrorism and resistance because they saw no path to justice through diplomacy or negotiation. These choices, made by countless individuals over decades, created the world we inherited. Adolf Ciso made choices too. He chose to join the PLO, to work in its security apparatus, and to operate in the gray zone between diplomacy and militancy. And whether those choices made him a legitimate target is a question that depends entirely on where you stand and what you believe about justice, resistance, and in the rules of war. The hotel in Cannes where he was killed still operates today, though under different management. Tourists check in, unaware of what happened in one of its rooms 3 decades ago. The Boulevard de la Croisette still fills each May with film stars and photographers. Life continues, indifferent to the ghosts that haunt its margins. In Israel, the operatives who carried out the assassination have retired, their identities still protected, and their actions still classified. Some may feel proud of their service, others may carry regrets they'll never voice publicly. They live ordinary lives, grandparents, and perhaps telling their grandchildren sanitized versions of their careers and leaving out the hotel hallways and the silenced pistols and the faces they still see sometimes in dreams. In Palestinian refugee camps across Lebanon, Jordan, and Gaza, Basizo's name is remembered among the martyrs, though he's far from the most famous. The children born after his death know the story, and another Palestinian leader killed by Israeli intelligence, another example of the occupation's ruthlessness. Another reason why resistance continues, And these parallel narratives never intersect. They exist in separate moral universes, each internally consistent, each utterly incomprehensible to the other side. And this is perhaps the deepest tragedy of the conflict, not the violence itself, but the impossibility of shared understanding. And the historical record will eventually declassify the Mossad files on the Cannes operation. 50 years, maybe 75, after the operation, and researchers will be able to read the operational planning documents, the intelligence assessments, the after-action reports. They'll learn the names of the operatives and the exact sequence of events, the debates within the Israeli government about authorization, and that knowledge will settle some factual questions, but resolve none of the moral ones. Because the ultimate question posed by the Bsiso assassination and by every targeted killing before and since is not whether intelligence agencies have the capability to hunt down enemies across borders. They clearly do. And the question is whether that capability, exercised repeatedly over decades, makes the world safer or simply more violent. And Israel would argue that without targeted killings, attacks against its citizens would be far more frequent and deadly. And Palestinian factions would argue that the killings themselves are attacks on their people, that resistance is justified, and that the cycle will continue until the occupation ends. Both arguments contain truth. Both are incomplete. And what happened in Cannes in June 1991 was simultaneously a successful counterterrorism operation and an act of state-sponsored assassination. And it was both justified self-defense and extrajudicial killing. It saved Israeli lives by eliminating a threat and cost Palestinian lives by removing a potential mediator. And it was professional and cold-blooded, necessary and tragic, effective and counterproductive. It was, in other words, and typical of the impossible moral terrain that defines conflict in the Middle East, where every action generates equal and opposite reactions, and where security measures create insecurity, where the pursuit of peace through violence ensures that peace remains perpetually out of reach. And Atef Siso checked into that hotel thinking about film festivals and political meetings and perhaps dinner later that evening. And he never imagined those would be his last thoughts. The operatives who killed believed they were protecting their country, eliminating a legitimate threat, and doing difficult but necessary work. They weren't wrong, exactly. But they weren't entirely right either. And so the story ends not with resolution but with continuation. And the conflict persists. The assassinations continue. New names are added to target lists. New operations are planned in secure facilities. New families will mourn. And new cycles of revenge will spin outward into an unknowable future. On the Crozet in Cannes, the Mediterranean still sparkles in the sunlight, and the film festival still celebrates cinema's power to tell stories, to reveal truth, to help us understand the human condition. And somewhere in the crowds, and among the tourists and the artists and the beautiful people, there might be another operative, tracking another target, and preparing another operation that will one day become another story about the terrible things we do to each other in the name of survival. And the red carpet has been cleaned many times since 1991. But some stains never fully disappear. They seep into the fabric, invisible but permanent, and a reminder that beneath the glamour and the glitz, violence is always waiting, patient and persistent, for its moment to strike. This is the legacy of Cannes, June 1991, and not just one killing, but a symbol of countless others, a chapter in a book that has no final page, only turning leaves that reveal the same story told in different ways, and generation after generation, until everyone forgets why it started but no one can imagine how it might end.